Welcome to the Majestic Truth Podcast. Join us as we delve into the mysteries of the universe, explore the unexplained, and shed light on some of the most important events that have occurred and are occurring in our world today. Get ready to open your mind, expand your horizons, and discover the extraordinary. This is the Majestic Truth Podcast. And now your host, Michelle.
Welcome aboard, truth seekers. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare for an unforgettable ride. Together we'll question, explore, and embrace the majesty of truth. I am so grateful you are here today. I've been on the other side of the mic for over 20 years, producing radio shows and podcasts. I have made it a life mission of mine to explore the most mysterious events, to shed light on the past, to prepare for the future, and remind us to never stop researching and seeking answers to explain these extraordinary events that have occurred throughout history. Before we kick off the show here, head on over to majestictruth.com/episode 7. That's majestictruth.com/episode 7. That's the number 7. And grab the downloadable that has the overview for this episode. And there is also a link to the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truths PDF overview of what science says about the destruction of World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7. You definitely want to check it out. We're going to go over a lot of highlights from that PDF, so if you download it, it goes into much more detail. Today, we delve into the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truths theory, a narrative that challenges the status quo and instigates a quest for truth and justice. A tale that centers on the fall of World Trade Center Building 7, a skyscraper that, according to them, did not merely crumble under the chaos of that fateful day, but fell victim to a controlled demolition. Not just Building 7, but the Twin Towers as well. Now, Building 7 was a 47-story skyscraper that stood adjacent to the Twin Towers. It was not hit by a plane on 9/11, but it collapsed at 5:20 p.m. that same day, with the official explanation being fires caused by debris from the Twin Towers. However, the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth believe that the collapse of Building 7 was not due to fires, but instead was a controlled demolition. They argue that the building fell at near free fall speed, which is only possible with a controlled demolition. The same theory holds true for how they believe World Trade Center 1 and 2 came down as well. The organization has collected a large body of evidence to support their claims. This includes the fact that Building 7 exhibited many characteristics of controlled demolitions, such as symmetrical collapse, demolition wave velocities, and patterns of debris ejection. Additionally, the collapse was preceded by the sudden failure of a small number of columns in the building, which is a telltale sign of a controlled demolition. Even more intriguing is the fact that Building 7 housed several important government agencies, including the Secret Service and the CIA. Some people claim that this suggestion that the collapse was orchestrated by the government, possibly as part of a larger conspiracy. However, this remains the subject of much debate. Many people dismiss the claims of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth as mere conspiracy theories, but they are supported by over 3,500 respected architects and engineers. They also note that their claims are backed up by extensive scientific analysis and data, which should never be ignored. They argue that the building's collapse was too symmetrical, too perfect to be an accident. They contest that it was not the flames that sealed Building 7's fate, but a premeditated act of destruction, a controlled demolition. In the quest for answers to 9/11, this theory has become one of the most controversial topics among truth seekers. So today, we ask the question: what is the Building 7 and World Trade Center 1 and 2 theory? According to NIST, the official explanation, World Trade Center Building 1 and 2 came down because of damage from airplane impacts and fires, and World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed completely into its own footprint because of office fires caused by debris that fell from the collapse of World Trade Center Building 1. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, which I will refer to as AE 9/11 for the sake of brevity, believe all three buildings came down by a procedure known as controlled demolition. Before September 11, 2001, no steel-framed building has ever collapsed by any other means than controlled demolition. Fires have never caused the total collapse of a steel-framed high-rise building. Modern steel-framed buildings generally endure fires without being structurally compromised because they have fire protection to prevent the steel from heating to the point where it loses a significant amount of its strength. This is usually in the form of drywall, concrete, or sprayed-on insulation. There is a table in the PDF from AE 9/11 and also in the episode downloadable showing the distinct differences between a controlled demolition versus fire-induced failure. I want to read these off to you because each one of these really adds weight to the claims AE 9/11 is making in their theory of the three buildings collapsing due to a controlled demolition. An important quote preceding this table: when a building's cause of collapse is controlled demolition, the building exhibits virtually none of the features of fire-induced failure. Similarly, when a building suffers a fire-induced failure, it exhibits virtually none of the key features of a controlled demolition. All right, so get the downloadable from AE 9/11. We link to it on the episode download page. So I'm going to read to you the controlled demolition side of the table versus the fire-induced failure side of the table. Number one, the collapse. All right, this is the controlled demolition side. Number one, the collapse is total, leaving virtually no parts of the building standing. On the other side of this, the fire-induced failure side, the collapse is usually partial, always partial in the case of steel-framed buildings, leaving much of the building standing. Number two, the onset of collapse is always sudden in a controlled demolition. In a fire-induced failure, the onset of collapse is gradual, with visible building deformations appearing prior to the actual collapse. Number three, the collapse lasts a matter of seconds in a controlled demolition. In a fire-induced failure, the collapse takes place over many minutes or hours. Number four, the collapse typically starts at the base of the building, though it can be engineered as top-down also. In a fire-induced failure, the collapse occurs randomly anywhere in the building. Number five, the building descends symmetrically through what was the path of greatest resistance, though asymmetrical collapses are sometimes engineered on purpose. In a fire-induced failure, the collapse is always asymmetrical. Number six, the building typically descends to the ground at near free fall acceleration in a controlled demolition. In a fire-induced failure, the descent of falling portions of the building is slowed or stopped by the lower sections of the building. Number seven, demolition squibs, which are isolated explosive ejections, are visible outside the main zone of destruction in a controlled demolition. In a fire-induced failure, explosions only occur at the location of fires, if at all. Number eight, concrete and other materials are sometimes pulverized, resulting in fine dust clouds in controlled demolitions. In fire-induced failures, concrete and other materials are not pulverized. Not pulverized. Most of the building's remaining structure is left intact or in large sections. Number 9, the building's steel structure is totally or mostly dismembered in a controlled demolition. In a fire-induced failure, the building's steel structure is mostly left intact, even if heavily damaged. Okay, now with all of that in mind, on September 11, 2001, the destruction of the 3 buildings exhibited nearly all of the features of a controlled demolition and none of the features of a fire-induced failure. If the destruction of World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7 were caused by fire, this would make them the first steel-framed high-rise buildings in history to suffer total fire-induced collapse. They would also be the first fire-induced collapses to exhibit nearly all of the features of controlled demolition and none of the features of fire-induced collapse. Edward Moniak, a fire protection engineer, puts it this way: even one progressive global collapse would have been extraordinary, but to have 3 occur in one day was just beyond comprehension. Here's a quote from an article in the Wall Street Journal on September 19, 2001, by Ronald Hamburger, Chief Structural Engineer for ABS Consulting in Oakland, California. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Hamburger ended up being on the crew organized by FEMA to investigate the World Trade Center destruction. So that brings us to the next point. How did Hamburger know that no bombs had been detonated? FEMA investigators were not granted access to the site until the week of October 7th. No one at this time of his September 19th quote had conducted any forensic analysis of the debris or interviewed any witnesses. According to AE 9/11, the likely answer is that between September 11th and the time that he was interviewed, the government and the media had put forth an account of the day's events that was incompatible with his original assessment that the buildings had been brought down with explosives. Certainly, it would seem highly unlikely that al-Qaeda could have gained access to the buildings and rigged them to be demolished without being detected. Therefore, as Hamburger essentially stated, he ruled out his initial hypothesis when he learned, to his surprise, that the official account did not include explosives being used to bring down the buildings. Now, Ronald Hamburger was not the only expert to rule out his initial hypothesis. On September 11th, Van Romero, an explosives expert at New Mexico Tech, told the Albuquerque Journal, the collapse of the building was too methodical to be the chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. My opinion is based on the videotapes that after the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. By September 21st, Romero changed his opinion after conversations with structural engineers, telling his local newspaper, certainly the fire is what caused the building to fail. Interesting. I guess we got to go with the narrative, right? Just wow. At the end of FEMA's official report is this quote: the specifics of the fire in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Although the total diesel fuel on the premises contained massive potential energy, the best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. No kidding, FEMA. So instead of looking into the other probable cause, aka controlled demolition, we give up at, well, the fire-induced collapse has a low probability of causing the collapse of these buildings. So let's throw our hands up and stop there. This is insane. Now NIST does its investigation, and its findings were released in August of 2002. They acknowledged that fire had never caused the total collapse of a high-rise building prior to September 11th, 2001. Nonetheless, it pursued its hypothesis confidently, even going as far as to declare it as fact. Here's a quote. The World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7 are the only known cases of total structural collapse in high-rise buildings where fire played a role. It's just unreal. I mean, they even acknowledge that these are the only cases in history, and 3 of them occurred on the same day. Wrap your head around that. Now, in April of 2005, NIST releases a progress report and states, quote, NIST has seen no evidence that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was caused by bombs, missiles, or controlled demolition. NIST did not describe what methods it used to search for evidence of controlled demolition because they never looked into it. Here are the steps from NIST of how they believe Building 7 collapsed. Here's the summary of NIST's probable collapse sequence for World Trade Center 7. Step 1. Debris from World Trade Center 1 ignited fires. Step 2. The fire spread. Step 3. Thermal expansion of beams. Step 4. Girder walk-off. Step 5. Cascade of floor failures. Step 6A. Buckling of columns 79. Step 6B. Buckling of columns 80 and 81. Step 8. Failure of the exterior columns. And this caused the building to just fall in free fall. Isn't that crazy? Because it is. One of the features of a controlled demolition is a sudden collapse. The features of a fire-induced failure is a gradual onset of collapse with randomly distributed, visible deformations appearing prior to the collapse. So NIST contradicts itself by the collapse not being sudden in 2 ways. Number 1, NIST claimed that the bowing of exterior columns began several minutes before the collapse initiated. If the inward bowing had been significant enough to affect the structure, it should have been much more pronounced. Number 2, NIST then claimed that the bowing walls buckled and that instability subsequently spread to the rest of the exterior columns. Yet there is no visual evidence of either of these phenomena occurring prior to the onset of collapse. According to Kevin Ryan, a former laboratory manager at Underwriters Laboratories, quote, instability spread would have taken much more time and would not result in uniform freefall, end quote. NIST's explanation for why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, quote, essentially in freefall, was limited to a half-page section of its 10,000-page report titled Events Following Collapse Initiation. In this section, NIST attempted to explain the speed and completeness of the collapses simply by saying, quote, it was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate what is clear from the videos, end quote. NIST investigator John Gross. A request for correction was submitted to NIST since they provided no calculations or modeling to support its claim. NIST used the videos of the event to back up its claim that the floors below offered no resistance. John Gross stated in a talk he gave at the University of Texas in October 2006, he actually refers to the video evidence as the reason why NIST did not perform analysis. Quote, once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate what is clear from the videos, end quote. I know I said the quote prior, but I really needed to say it again because of the absurdity of it. In a powerful response to NIST in the request for correction and a rebuttal to the above, quote, the families of the firefighters and World Trade Center employees that were trapped in the stairwells when the entirety of the World Trade Center towers collapsed on top of them would surely appreciate an adequate explanation of why the lower structure failed to arrest or even resist the collapse of the floors, end quote. And here's NIST's response to that statement. Quote, NIST carried its analysis to the point where the buildings reach global instability. At this point, because of the magnitude of deflections and the number of failures occurring, the computer models are not able to converge on a solution. We were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse, end quote. This makes me so angry. It's enraging to hear this. Now let's talk about the squibs. What are squibs? So there were these high velocity bursts of debris ejected from point-like structures. You can see this in the videos when the buildings are coming down. You see these bursts of debris happening below where the building is collapsing. These bursts of debris are the result of the detonation of explosive charges. These are squibs. So if you pull up videos on YouTube of the collapse, like play, pause, and watch as the buildings come down, you see these ejections coming out before the floors are toppling down. So it's collapse, and then as it's coming down, there's these spews of debris shooting out of the side of the building. NIST's explanation for these high velocity bursts of debris, which by the way, some were clocked at over 100 miles per hour. NIST calls them puffs of smoke and says, quote, the falling mass of the building compressed the air ahead of it, much like the action of a piston, forcing smoke and debris out the windows as the stories below failed sequentially, end quote. So you may say, this could make sense, right? And they're counting on you saying, okay, that explains it, and moving on with your life, right? Because they don't want you looking really close at this. But AE 911 says no. And Kevin Ryan offers arguments for why NIST's explanation is complete nonsense. Number one, the floors were not the kind of tightly sealed, highly pressurized containers that would be required to generate overpressure strong enough to burst windows. Number two, the falling mass would need to act as a flat plate exerting uniform pressure at all points. But the falling upper sections themselves disintegrating, as observed in the videos, could not exert uniform pressure. Number three, even if perfect containers and uniform pressures are assumed, using the ideal gas law to calculate the change in pressure, we can determine that the air pressure would not increase enough to burst windows. Number four, the burst contained pulverized debris, not smoke and dust. Yet building materials 20 to 30 stories below the collapse zone could not be pulverized and ejected laterally by air pressure. There's a great video by David Chandler, a physics teacher, called North Tower Exploding. He describes the explosive ejection of materials from Building 1. You can see this on YouTube. Quote, under the canopy of falling debris, do you see the rapid sequence of explosive ejections of material? Some of the jets have been clocked at over 100 miles per hour. They're continuous and widespread. They move progressively down the faces of the building, keeping pace with the falling debris. The building is being progressively destroyed from the top down by waves of explosions, creating a huge debris field. End quote. He also says the following, quote, notice that embedding in the dust clouds are huge girders and entire sections of steel framing that are being hurled out of the building. Some landed as much as 2 football fields away from the base of the tower, end quote. So now Chandler addresses those that go along with the NIST explanation and say the ejection of the girders is because of the spring action from the upper section crushing down upon them. It's really just even hard to, these explanations are absurd. Chandler says this, quote, some people have suggested that the weight of the tower crushing down the girders caused them to flex and they sprung sideways by a spring action. But we are not seeing isolated jumping girders. We are seeing a major fraction of the mass of the building reduced to small pieces of rubble and fine dust and being explosively ejected in all directions. So now remember, one of the features of a controlled demolition is concrete and other materials are sometimes pulverized, resulting in fine dust clouds. Whereas in a fire-induced failure, concrete and other materials are not pulverized. Most of the building's remaining structure is left intact or in large sections. Keep this in mind when I read to you the next quote from New York Governor George Pataki. Quote, "There's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. The concrete was pulverized. And I was down there on Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All over lower Manhattan, not just the site. From river to river, there was dust, powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized." End quote.
Well, what do you know?
What do you know? Now let's hear from Richard Gage. He's an architect and the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth on the case of the pulverized concrete.
Do we have enormous clouds of pyroclastic smoke from the pulverized concrete? Watch the concrete entrained in the air racing down every street in each direction at 35 miles an hour. This incredible volume of pyroclastic dust enfolding itself. It takes incredible quantities of heat to create this kind of action. A lot more heat than the 8 various fires that were on these floors.
It takes incredible quantities of heat to create these pulverized concrete clouds of smoke. A lot more heat than were on the 8 floors that were inflamed. As stated in the AE 9/11 PDF report, quote, "What can explain the near total pulverization of approximately 8.8 million square feet of 5.5-inch thick, lightweight concrete flooring and the near total dismemberment of 220 stories of steel structure? NIST provides no explanation, and gravity alone appears to be implausible. A simple analysis of the approximate amount of energy required to pulverize the concrete and dismember the steel structures indicates that about 1,255 gigajoules of energy would have been required, far exceeding the estimated 508 gigajoules of gravitational potential energy contained in the buildings." End quote. Now let's talk about eyewitness accounts of explosions. Now, aside from civilian accounts of hearing explosions, the FDNY gave over 500 personal statements of what happened that day. However, NIST says the following on their facts page, quote, "There was no evidence collected by NIST or by the FDNY of any blast or explosions in the region below the impact and fire floors as the top building sections began their downward movement upon collapse initiation." End quote. What on earth are you talking about, NIST? We have eyewitness accounts from 500 FDNY personnel that says otherwise. Let me read you some of these accounts. I got up. I got into the parking garages, was knocked down by the percussion. I thought there had been an explosion or a bomb that they had blown up there. Michael Donovan, FDNY. That's when I just broke down and cried at Bellevue Hospital because it was just so overwhelming. I just knew that what had happened was horrific. It was a bombing. Julio Marrero, FDNY. As we walked through those revolving doors, that's when we felt the rumble. I felt the rumbling, and then I felt the force coming at me. I was like, what the hell is that? In my mind, it was a bomb going off. The pressure got so great, I stepped back behind the columns separating the revolving doors. Then the force just blew past me. John Molly, FDNY. We took 2 steps. There was a tremendous boom, explosion. We both turned around, and the top of the building was coming down at us. With this, I just turned to Richie and said, "Run." Edward Kennedy, FDNY. The door closed, They went up, and it just seemed a couple seconds, and all of a sudden you just heard, like it almost actually that day sounded like bombs going off. Like boom, boom, boom. Like 7 or 8, and then just a huge wind. Thomas Turilli, FDNY. We were the first ones in the second tower after the plane struck. I was taking firefighters up in the elevator to the 24th floor to get in position to evacuate workers. On the last trip, a bomb went off. We think there was bombs set in the building. Louis Caccioli, FDNY. We were there, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then I just remember there was just an explosion. It seemed like on television they blow up these buildings. It seemed like that. It was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. Richard Gage, FDNY. As my officer and I were looking at the South Tower, it just gave. It actually gave at a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit, because we originally had thought there was like an internal detonation, explosives, because it went in succession. Boom, 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 boom. And then the tower came down. Edward Caccia, FDNY. I mean, that's just some of the witnesses. It's chilling. So I say again, NIST, what are you talking about? Are you saying that all of these first responders, these heroes, are lying? Okay, so 9/11, AE 9/11 lays out 5 areas of evidence for each of the proposed methods of destruction of the buildings. Number 1, sudden onset. Here's NIST's explanation. Their fire-induced failure theory. Ignore the suddenness and claim the occurrence of a series of structural failures for which there is no evidence. Versus independent researchers, the controlled demolition theory. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence of the sudden detonation of explosives. The second area of evidence, constant acceleration. NIST, their fire-induced failure theory. Stop analysis at the point of collapse initiation. Speculatively claim that the collapse became inevitable after conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Versus independent researchers, the controlled demolition theory. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence that explosives destroyed the lower structures before the upper sections reached them. The third area of evidence. Pulverization, dismemberment, and explosive ejection of materials. NIST's fire-induced failure method. Stop analysis at the point of collapse initiation. Do not acknowledge in the final report or in facts. Independent researchers, controlled demolition theory. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence that explosives pulverized, dismembered, and explosively ejected the building's material. The fourth area of evidence. Demolition squibs. NIST, stop analysis at the point of collapse initiation. Do not acknowledge in final report. Speculatively claim in FAQs that there are puffs of smoke caused by compressed air. Oh, man. Independent researchers. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence of explosives destroying the structure ahead of the collapse front. And the fifth area of evidence, eyewitness accounts of explosions. NIST, ignore in final report, and FAQs deny existence of evidence of explosions collected by the FDNY. When formally challenged, claim that the eyewitness accounts, quote, taken as whole, do not support the hypothesis of controlled demolition. Versus independent researchers, acknowledge and interpret as testimonial evidence for the use of explosives. Now, let's specifically talk about the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7. All right, loading up some more of these sound clips. This first clip is Ed Asner. He's presenting information in one of the many videos created by AE 9/11 Truth.
Explosives are used to demolish buildings like this in just seconds. Okay, so it's a controlled demolition. What's the problem with that? Well, it happened on the afternoon of 9/11 at the World Trade Center. Let's just think about this. Controlled demolitions cannot be engineered and rigged in a day. It takes months. And therefore, this event must have been planned in advance.
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back. We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
And these people heard explosions.
We heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out. The building followed after that.
He takes his hand off, and you hear 3, 2, 1, and it was boom, 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 boom.
And these reporters recognized it as a controlled demolition.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite.
So you hear explosions in the clips played, and you hear witnesses talk about the building is about to blow up, and a witness saying she was told by the fire department that they were going to have to bring it down. Others are saying they heard sounds like thunder and a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. The bottom floor caved out, and the building fell after that. Sounds odd, doesn't it? Then we hear from various reporters stating that they saw what appeared to be a controlled demolition. Next up, Ed talks about the government explanation for the collapse of Building 7.
So what's the problem if this was a planned demolition? Well, we are told by government agencies that this building came down as a result of normal office fires. The National Institute of Standards and Technology produced their final report in 2008.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
But what do you think brought down the building?
And what caught my eye is more than 1,300 architects and engineers examine the evidence about Building 7's collapse and disagree with the official report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects.
That last media clip was Geraldo. You may have recognized his voice. So according to NIST, Building 7 came down due to office fires. Okay. This makes me so angry. NIST acknowledges that World Trade Center 7 fell at a rate of freefall, or the rate of gravity, for a period of approximately 2.25 seconds before it started to slow down. Here are some clips from AE 9/11 about Building 7. So here we have Stephen Dusterwald, a structural engineer.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
No resistance to the descent whatsoever. Next clip is from Ronald Brookman, a structural engineer. Now, these clips are all from AE 9/11 Truth. You definitely want to do further research on their website, ae911truth.org. So here we have Ronald Brookman.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories. And going from motionless to free fall instantly, that's a bothersome part of the puzzle because NIST never explained it.
Of course they didn't explain it. Didn't fit the narrative. Free fall for 8 stories. Okay, next up, we have Michael Donnelly, structural engineer, and Kathy McGrade, metallurgical engineer.
We've got a building that came down in its own footprint, so all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time in order for that structure to fall the way that we saw.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
All of the columns needed to be severed at the same time in order for the building to collapse the way it did and reach free fall status. And the symmetry of the collapse, according to Kathy McGrade, is the smoking gun. Now, back to back here, we hear from Anthony Zimbardi, mechanical engineer, Scott Granger, forensic fire protection engineer, Kamal Abid, structural engineer, and Tom Sullivan, explosives technician.
The whole building completely comes down in one continuous motion. There couldn't have been any structural resistance.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
It is possible that you could have a local failure as a result of a connection failing. But the likelihood of that failure dragging the entire building in such a fashion that all the columns would fail at the same time is an impossibility.
Impossibility?
Yes.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
No structural resistance? All the columns failing at the same time is an impossibility. And the last clip, what I saw was a classic implosion. And this was from the explosives technician, Tom Sullivan. David Chandler, the physics teacher we talked about earlier, says the following about Building 7's freefall. Quote, freefall is not consistent with any natural scenario involving weakening, buckling, or crushing, because in any such scenario, there would be large forces of interaction with the underlying structure that would have slowed the fall. Natural collapse resulting in freefall is simply not plausible. End quote. Making this more and more likely to be caused by a controlled demolition. How could office fires cause such a symmetrical freefall? Chandler also says the following, quote, the collapse we see cannot be due to a column failure or a few column failures, or a sequence of column failures. All 24 interior columns and 58 perimeter columns had to have been removed over the span of 8 floors low in the building simultaneously to within a small fraction of a second, and in such a way that the top half of the building remains intact and uncrumpled, end quote. So now, how about the fact that Building 7 collapsed almost entirely into its original footprint? How could this be achieved by a spontaneous, fire-induced, gravity-driven collapse? And guess what? NIST's computer model terminates shortly after the start of the collapse, and they fail to explain the structural dismemberment and compact pile of debris in any section of their report. All right, now let's hear from Richard Gage, the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth.
I'm Richard Gage. Fires have never before caused the collapse of any skyscraper, even though there are numerous examples of much hotter, larger, and longer-lasting fires in these buildings. And in the case of Building 7, the fire that NIST said started the collapse had actually burned out over an hour before. It could not have caused the collapse, as NIST claims. Yet this 47-story, modern steel-frame skyscraper, which was not hit by an airplane, collapses mostly into its own footprint like a house of cards, as fast as a bowling ball falling off the side of the building, in just under 7 seconds.
Building 7 collapses into its own footprint, and it does so in just under 7 seconds. Here's a clip from the Blueprint for Truth film by AE 9/11. This is Professor Jonathan Barnett from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
No chance of a sudden collapse. Definitely not a symmetrical one. Here we have Richard Gage, the founder of AE 9/11 again, regarding the sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure, proving this was a controlled demolition, not destruction by fire.
Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Let's listen to this emergency word.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, and windows busting out, and then the building coming down.
Sounds pretty convincing to me. Here's Gage again with our next clip on do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, which is typical of controlled demolitions.
Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate this collapse for us as we take our first look at the collapse of Building 7.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What, Dan? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Dan never repeated these words after this first day. In fact, we didn't see this building coming down after 9/11.
Dan Rather says it looks like on TV when a building is deliberately taken down by explosives. Why didn't we hear these words repeated after 9/11? I'll tell you. Because it doesn't fit the narrative. Again, there were sounds of explosions on September 11th around the collapse of these buildings. According to NIST, there were no sounds of explosions, nor were there eyewitness accounts of anyone claiming to hear explosions. So now let's load up a sound clip here. Here's Richard Gage on hearing sounds of explosions. Listen to this.
Do we have sounds of explosions, though? Here's Craig Bartmer from the New York Police Department.
The whole time you hear him boom, 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 boom. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it. I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did. And a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
How about Kevin McPadden?
He came back over with his hand over the radio, and what sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
These are clips from witnesses that were there. They heard this with their own ears and felt the explosions because they were there. So to sum it up, AE 9/11 put together another great chart for the two opposing areas of evidence for the collapse of Building 7. There are 4 main areas of evidence in this chart. Number 1, sudden symmetrical freefall. NIST's fire-induced failure theory, they attempt to deny the occurrence of freefall, then acknowledge it but obscure its significance and provide no explanation. Versus independent researchers, the controlled demolition theory. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence that explosives were used to remove all of the columns simultaneously. Second area of evidence, structural dismemberment into a compact debris pile. NIST's fire-induced failure theory. Terminate computer models shortly after collapse initiation and provide no explanation for observed phenomena. Versus independent researchers, the controlled demolition theory, acknowledge and interpret as evidence that explosives dismembered the structure and deposited it into a complete compact debris pile. Area of evidence number 3, eyewitness accounts of explosions. NIST's fire-induced theory. Deny the existence of audio recordings and eyewitness accounts of explosions. Versus independent researchers' controlled demolition theory. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence of explosives. Area of evidence number 4, foreknowledge of destruction. NIST's fire-induced failure theory provide a hypothesis that is incompatible with the high degree of confidence and precision with which the destruction of World Trade Center 7 was anticipated. Versus independent researchers' controlled demolition theory. Acknowledge and interpret as evidence of foreknowledge that World Trade Center 7 was going to be brought down. Now, number 4 is covered in various videos at ae911truth.org and in the PDF. The claim is there was knowledge in advance that Building 7 was going to be brought down. There are various media outlets that reported the building came down before it even came down. It's crazy stuff. So check that out at ae911truth.org. Now, last but definitely not least, let's discuss that thermite and molten metal found in the debris. Here's Richard Gage, the founder of AE 9/11, on the molten metal.
Do we have pools of molten iron? Let's start with the South Tower now. This section applies to the World Trade Center Twin Towers and Building 7. We're told by NIST that this substance must be melted aluminum from the airplane. But melted aluminum looks like melted aluminum. It's silvery. It doesn't glow in daylight conditions. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running, says World Trade Center structural engineer Leslie Robertson to a conference of structural engineers on October 5th, 2001, 1 month after 9/11. Debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Fires burned, molten metal flowed in the pile of ruins, still settling beneath my feet. Well, what do the first responders and the demolition contractors say about molten metal? Saw pools of literally molten steel. Molten metal beams had just been totally melted. It was dripping from the molten steel. Steel flowed in molten streams. They're finding molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams. Molten metal, red hot, weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Molten steel beams, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down the broken walls. Molten metal dripping from a beam. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. And this structural engineer, Abu Hassan Astani from Berkeley, cites and documents, I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. Still so hot that molten metal dripped down the side of the wall from Building 6. A fire truck 10 feet below the ground that was still burning 2 weeks after the tower collapsed. Its metal so hot that it looked like a vat of molten steel. Pieces of steel, still cherry red.
So we have plenty of testimony here of witnesses seeing molten metal at ground zero. How can this be? Regular fires would not cause this. Now we have a clip of an exchange with John Gross, the lead engineer for the NIST report, and then listen right after it as a clip is played of the FDNY firemen talking about the molten steel they personally witnessed at Ground Zero.
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
I am too.
And
please tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but eyewitnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers, and some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel. And physics professor analyzed some of the steel, and Stephen Jones, and he found evidence of thermate residue, which would explain how the buildings collapsed by means of pre-planted explosives. So, have you analyzed the steel for any of those residues?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was
Like
lava
lava.
from a volcano.
No eyewitness who said so.
There actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
No eyewitness who said so.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
No eyewitness who said so.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
No eyewitness who said so.
As of 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running, says World Trade Center structural engineer Leslie Robertson.
No eyewitness who said so.
Saw pools of literally molten steel.
No eyewitness who said so.
And this structural engineer documents, I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center.
Nobody who's produced it.
So, Mr. Gross, did you not hear the testimony of these firemen? I mean, this is one clip of many witnesses that saw the molten steel. This is just complete negligence and a blatant disregard for what these heroes and first responders witnessed themselves. What an incredible montage that was put together for this film, Blueprint for Truth. You definitely want to head on over to ae911truth.org and check out all of the films they have on their site. Now here's Gage on thermite.
How about chemical evidence, though? What produced all this molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
Thermite. An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Steel melts at 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit. Could this be what sliced through the beams of the World Trade Center buildings, creating these symmetrical freefall collapses? Thermite was found at Ground Zero. Explain that. The New York Times even calls this the deepest mystery of all. Thermite and sulfur giving the situation thermate, which lowers the melting point of steel and accelerates the collapse. How could this happen? And why would this be present at Ground Zero? And here's another Kathy McGrade clip, followed by a clip from Niels Harrit, PhD in chemistry from the University of Copenhagen.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron. R.J. Lee Company, USGS, and Dr. Stephen Jones's work, all three separately found these microspheres.
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips, which have different properties, and in the reaction they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction. And such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures.
An office fire cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. But we had molten iron present during 9/11, and thermitic materials were found in the dust. And when thermite reacts, it produces molten iron. And these reactions can be used to destroy steel structures. Now let's hear from Mark Basile, a chemical engineer.
I've independently seen thermitic activity within 2 separate independent samples of World Trade Center dust. My contention, based on finding thermite residue in the dust, is that it happened before. It didn't happen after in the fires that ensued in the rubble pile afterwards. All the characteristics of the microspheres tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
Thermitic activity within not 1, but 2 separate independent samples of World Trade Center dust. And then he states that thermite was involved with melting those steel beams. Here's a clip from Stephen Jones, PhD, professor from Brigham Young University, and from Lynn Margulis, PhD professor from the University of Massachusetts, regarding NIST testing for explosives.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
So the preconceived notion of NIST is that there's no evidence for explosives, and so there's no point in looking. That is the most unscientific thing that you can possibly think of, not to look because you don't expect to find evidence, and in fact the evidence is overwhelming. They state these conclusions for which there's virtually no evidence, and then they ignore conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence.
So because NIST's narrative was that the 3 World Trade Center buildings came down due to uncontrollable fires, they never tested for evidence of explosives. Because this theory doesn't fit the narrative. This is completely unscientific and wrong on so many levels. Now, regarding the destruction of evidence from Ronald Brookman, structural engineer, and once again from Lynn Margulis.
The destruction of evidence was a criminal act in itself. It was already being carted away and destroyed when the FEMA investigators got there about a month after September 11th.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
So when the FEMA investigators arrived, the evidence was already being removed and destroyed. How could a proper investigation be done if the evidence was being destroyed? So there's been serious, significant evidence presented here from AE 9/11. I encourage you to visit ae911truth.org and sign their petition. Here's a clip from Robert Bowman. He has 3 degrees in engineering and also a retired lieutenant colonel for the U.S. Air Force. He flew over 100 combat missions in Vietnam, and he's the Director of Strategic Defense Initiative for the U.S. Department of Defense. Now, those are some noteworthy credentials that command respect.
As an engineer, and I have 3 degrees in engineering, I signed that petition for architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth some time ago because the American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
They need and deserve the truth. Too many lives were lost that day, and we want answers. Here's former Senator Mike Gravel.
Look at the evidence. In fact, I'll say this very categorically.
any reasonable person who looks at the evidence that's been brought forward has got to come away with the feeling that something has to be done, a real investigation has to be put forward.
Agreed. Here's Michelle Little. She lost her firefighter brother David on 9/11, and also Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son Bobby on 9/11.
I'm a family member trying to find out the answers to the murder of 3,000 plus people. The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated properly.
Please look at architects and engineers. People all around the world, scientists all around the world are questioning this. And there's some deep, deep explaining to do.
Yes, there is some explaining to do. And these families deserve a full investigation, and they deserve answers. Now here's Jane Policino. She lost her husband Steve on 9/11.
The country owns this. We were all victims. You all should want answers. It's not just ours, not just mine. We all lost something that day.
We all should want answers, and whether you lost someone you knew and loved that day or not, we all lost. Lives were lost, and it deserves a proper investigation to find the truth, leaving no stone unturned in the quest for answers, backed by science and complete evidence. So we covered a lot here in this episode. September 11th still weighs heavy on the heart. I do believe there should be a more complete and thorough investigation into that traumatic and sad day. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth have put together some great evidence that deserves an official investigation. These families and first responders deserve the truth. We all do. And the time that it takes to find it. What are your thoughts? Send them my way to truth@majestictruth.com. I'd love to hear from you. Again, visit ae911truth.org and sign the petition. Do the research. Look into this. It's definitely worth your time. All right, truth seekers. That concludes this episode of Majestic Truth. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the depths of the unknown with us today. Remember, the pursuit of truth and the quest for knowledge are ongoing journeys. So stay curious, stay open-minded, always follow your dreams, and keep seeking answers. Next week, we will dive into the Labor Day UFO incident that took place in 1969. 4 families with no prior connection alleged that they saw a UFO, were moved by a beam of light, and lost several hours of time. Crazy stuff. For more information on this episode about the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and to get downloadable for this episode, visit majestictruth.com/episode 7. Thanks for joining me, Truth Seekers. I'm grateful for every listener and humbled by every subscriber. Don't forget to mark your calendars and set your alarms, because our next episode will be available next Tuesday on your favorite podcast app. Trust us, you won't want to miss it. Until then, keep your eyes on the skies, your mind open, and remember, the truth is out there.
For updates, behind-the-scenes content, and a chance to engage with fellow truth seekers, stay connected with us on social media. Find us on Twitter at TruthSeekerPod, Instagram at Majestic Truth Seekers, and TikTok at Majestic Truth Seekers. Tune in next week as we explore the Labor Day 1969 UFO incident. Thanks for listening.